But Cathy has done so many classes for Renaissance Society, and she tends to specialize on American history, fair enough, but she's also done Irish history, and whatever she does is always incredibly well received by her students. So thank you, Cathy, and welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me? It's working? Good.
You want to turn.
Well, yeah, we will. Thank you. It's the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the American Revolution in Massachusetts, in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And so I'm going to talk today about, give you a little bit of an overview about the revolution. Okay, so this is an outline of what I'll talk about. Britain and America were on a collision course. The revolution didn't just happen. There was a long lead up of conflict and misunderstandings and very poor communication. And I'm going to go through the multiple causes of the revolution. The war actually started in Massachusetts, April 19th, 1775. And how you experienced the war depended on where you lived and who you were. So I try to do that very much in summary fashion. This is a great quote. By the way, I want to say first, before I do that, that's Sam Adams. And he was an early revolutionary advocate. And that's a statue of him in front of the Boston State House. No relation, unfortunately. I'm also no relation to this gentleman. He said the revolution was effected before the war commenced. And I think a lot of people would agree with him on that. So there had been a big war between France and Britain and a lot of other countries, and Britain came out on top. Yay, we won. And then, boo, we have a huge debt. We also got a lot of territory. So this is called the First British Empire. And they got a lot of land in North America, in Canada, and Spanish Florida. They agreed to protect Catholics in Quebec, which was a very touchy subject because of the prohibitions against Catholics practicing their religion openly in England and Ireland. Britain solidified its control over India. This early, they were in India. And as I said, it established the First British Empire. Here's a cool map. The one on the left is what North America looked like from a European perspective before the 7 Years' War. And you can see this sort of striped area. That's the area that native tribes controlled. This is the British American colonies. And all here is all French. After the war, you can see how big the pink part got. And that's them getting tons and tons of territory. They viewed the colonies as a source of tax revenue. And they wanted, and the Americans were paying about a quarter of the level of taxation that British citizens were. They had had sort of a period of what's called salutary neglect or benign neglect of American colonies. And so you know how it is when you let your teenager really run wild and then you try to rein them in, it's hard. Well, that's what happened. Not that we were teenagers. The other exciting thing happening in England was the Industrial Revolution was getting underway. And they were mechanizing things that had been in home trade, things like the textile industry. And they were able to put water wheels along the rivers and use that power to run a number of different machines they invented to make cloth. They had new ways to make iron. They built canals, and that was their way. It's kind of like the old-fashioned highway, the way to bring goods back and forth. And as I said, yay, we won. Boo, we got a big old debt. And they had borrowed that debt. So their interest payment on the debt took up half of their annual tax revenues. Now, we laugh at these figures, but at the time it was a big deal, okay? Because our debt is so much larger than this. So Americans paid 6 shillings compared to 25 shillings by the people of Britain. So they said, let's tax these people. So the prime minister at the time, and he didn't last very long, was a guy named George Grenville. And he wanted to pay, have the Americans pay a tax to support the troops that were protecting them. And this was the first tax that went in. All of these taxes had to be paid in silver or gold. And the Americans did not have silver or gold, and very short supply. And it was a huge miscalculation. And each time they laid on a tax, they had to repeal it. So they had 3 rounds of this. From America, here's what's going on in America. Population growth, annual rate of 30 to 40% from 1700 to 1770. They were prosperous. There was very little income inequality. It's not like our country is today with really rich people at the top. It wasn't like that. It was a big group of yeoman farmers and artisans in the mid-Atlantic and New England states. A very high proportion of white men in America had the right to vote, between 60 and 80% compared to 15% in England. With this tremendous population growth, they really wanted to get past the mountains into that striped area on that map, into native land. And the king had issued a proclamation saying, you can't do that. They disregarded that. Thousands went in there. So we're talking about Kentucky, Tennessee, and some in Ohio. So why could so many more white men vote? Because the criteria for voting in America had been brought over from England, where very few people owned land. And so all you had to do, you had to have 40 acres of land or the equivalent value in tools. So like if you had a blacksmith shop or a leather working shop. So 20% could vote in England, between 60 and 80%, depending on the colony, could vote. And the ties with Britain had weakened because there had been so many generations that had gone by from the first waves of settlement. British public didn't know how big America was. The maps that were published in Britain at the time, so the colony is really little. But in reality, Charleston is as far from Boston, right, as London is from Venice. They had no idea how big it was. They also did not have good maps. Americans were losing personal ties after many generations. I found a little piece of paper that I'd written on God knows what year, because my desk, archaeological dig, okay, I found a little piece of paper. I'd looked up, obviously I'd wondered, why didn't they have maps? And the answer is the French army and the Spanish army had cartographers. And the British army said, no, we don't need that. And so they were, I think, in the middle of the revolution when they finally started getting cartographers on board. And this would hurt them later on in the war. The time between the first English settlers and the beginning of the revolution is the same as the time between the end of the revolution and the start of the Second World War. And so that gives you a sense of how much time had gone by. In this period of salutary neglect, the king and the ministers let America have democratically elected assemblies. And the royal governors, a lot of them were corrupt, so they were interested in making money for themselves and their families. They let the assemblies make decisions on taxes, appointments, things like that. In New England, the towns are governed by something called a town meeting. We don't have our city council like in the city of Sacramento. This is like a very representative body. I lived in a New England town. There was one town meeting member for like every 500 residents. So they'd have these massive meetings to vote the town budget. And that's what they did back then as well. There were 100 newspapers and very lively political debate. This morning in our class, Dan Rooney shared the fact that 2/3 of American white men could read. And so I don't think the literacy was that high in England. So there were a lot of causes for this revolution: the Enlightenment philosophy, the threat to the rights of American colonists as British citizens, and then this huge pressure to get into the native lands. So the Enlightenment philosophy, John Locke is a big leader in this, the idea of natural rights and consent of the governed, that everyone's born equal. Rousseau is another important thinker, that there's a social contract between the people and the government. And when that contract is violated because the government doesn't care about your rights or your ability to survive, the people have a right to change the government. Also, the idea that government power should be limited to protect individual rights. This is a real departure from the philosophy, for example, of the Middle Ages, where everybody had their place. Now, this is a painting of King George. This was painted during the Revolution, and he liked to be portrayed in a military uniform. He considered himself the ultimate arbiter of colonial policy, and he was the governor of the Church of England, and so his authority there came by divine will. But his royal power was not absolute. It had been limited by two big events in England: the English Civil War, Cromwell against Charles I, 1650, and the Glorious Revolution that ousted James I in 1689. They adopted a Bill of Rights in England. And so he wasn't completely free to do whatever he wanted, but he really wanted strong central authority. He wanted to curb Parliament and curb the power of colonial leaders. He is the driving force in British policy during the American Revolution. So during the lead up, the big thing were these taxes. So here are the taxes. The first one was the Sugar Act in 1764. A year later, the Stamp Act. So the Sugar Act was a tax on imported sugar from the West Indies that they used to make molasses and rum. They liked their rum, okay? The Stamp Act was a tax on every piece of paper you could think of, from a marriage license to playing cards to deeds, everything. And then in 1766, so 1 year later, they were both repealed because of the pressure from the colonies. The following year, they said, oh, we'll try another approach. Townshend, he was a Chancellor of the Exchequer, I think. And that was everything that was lead, paint, glass, and tea. And in 1770, the very day of the Boston Massacre, Parliament had repealed the Townshend Act except for the tax on tea. And by doing these taxes this way, the Parliament had bypassed colonial assemblies that normally levied taxes on Americans. America had no seat in Parliament. One of the things that Sam Adams would say is, they have as much right to levy a tax on us as we do to levy a tax on them. In other words, they're not represented in our assemblies. Every time they'd put a tax on, there'd be big protests. The Crown officials would be tarred and feathered and who knows what else. You really harassed until they resigned. And so each time the tax would be repealed. Lord North had a preference for East India Company tea because there was a glut of tea, and a lot of wealthy British people were invested in the East India Company, including the Bank of England. He thought the Bank of England might fail if the East India Company failed. And so he was going to create a tax preference for East India tea. So after all these taxes, you know, there's always these unforeseen consequences. And one of them was that there was a continental identity emerging. Before that, they identified by the colony they were at. So I'm a Virginia and you're a Massachusetts. No, we're all Americans in this. So like any situation, there was a range of opinion. So in England, the biggest hardliner was the king. Lord North was the prime minister. He was not quite as hardline, but pretty hardline. And then William Pitt the Elder was a real statesman who tried to negotiate some kind of an agreement. It didn't work. It got voted down by the House of Lords. On our side, Sam Adams and Patrick Henry represent the real true believers, might say you know, kind of a fanatic or whatever, but they're the ones that really wanted independence. And John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, he wanted to compromise, and he had the Continental Congress put forth something called the Olive Branch Petition, where they reached out to the king. Didn't work. Okay, this man is important in 1775. Thomas Gage, he was both the commander-in-chief of all the military in the American colonies, and he was the royal governor. It's kind of two big jobs. He was an aristocrat, second son of Viscount Gage, bought his commission in the army, and that's the way they did it. He fought in the Battle of Culloden. If any of you are of Scottish heritage, you do not have a happy memory of hearing about the Battle of Culloden. That's when the clan chiefs were slaughtered. He went to America for the French and Indian War, and after the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, he was pulled out and replaced by William Howe. His family had a history of being on the wrong side of pretty much everything. They sided, I've never even heard of anybody, they sided with King John against the barons and against the Magna Carta. Okay, goodness. He supported Charles I during the English Civil War. His family was Catholic until 1715, when one of his ancestors says, I want horses, and Catholics couldn't own horses in England. That was one way to harass Catholics, is not let them own horses. Well, this guy loved his horses more than his religion, apparently. This guy had very mixed results in the battlefield. He had some wins, but some pretty good losses. He was getting promoted continually because of his brother, Lord Gage. So it's kind of like Peter Principle situation at work here. He did, however, marry a woman who would be quite helpful to the American cause, Margaret Kemble. And she was from a wealthy family. She was beautiful, she was smart. And here's a contemporary. She was apart from him for long periods. And when they were together, she lectured him about liberty and justice in that self-righteous American way. Okay. Okay, here's the rumor that she passed key information along to a patriot leader named Dr. Joseph Warren. She told him what date they were going to march out to Concord. And so the colonists were able to hide the munitions. So here's the timeline. The Boston Tea Party was when the colonists really rejected this tax-free tea and the high-handed manner in which it was done. So they dumped tea in the Boston Harbor, about $1 million worth. And for that amount, Lord North really overreacted and did these intolerable acts, which I will describe. In response to that, the Americans got together in the First Continental Congress. A year later, the war started in Massachusetts. And after that, British troops had to evacuate Boston. The Second Continental Congress declared independence. So the British government really wanted to isolate and punish Massachusetts. So they passed what they called the coercive acts, but Americans call them the intolerable acts. They wanted to show other colonies, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't comply with our rules. The other colonies' reaction was, oh my God, they could do this to us. We better fight back and support Boston. So the coercive acts backfired, and the colonies met in the Continental Congress and ultimately would declare independence. So here are the coercive acts. The Port Act, they closed the port of Boston and to all but food and fuel, really choking off the trade economy in Boston. And this is a contemporary cartoon showing Boston on the Liberty Tree, and these are the other colonies trying to get them food. The Massachusetts Government Act canceled the charter and moved the capital from Boston to Salem, which is a small town north of Boston. Prohibited town meetings without the royal governor's consent. So it would be like if the President of the United States prohibited city council meetings. How would we feel about that? We would not feel good about that. The Murder Act meant that any British official or military man charged with a serious crime had to be tried in England or another colony. Now, coupled with the next one, they had troops living in their homes. So if a rowdy soldier did something to your family, they could get taken back to England for trial. So this is an assault on trial by jury. The Quebec Act gave Canada the land from the Appalachians all the way to Mississippi River. And it gave freedom of religion to Catholics. And there was a conspiracy theory that Gage wanted to make New England Catholic. I don't think so, but anyway. Gage had proposed the Intolerable Acts to the king. And the king and Lord North never recognized the legitimacy of the Continental Congress. So they had no one to negotiate with. There were no diplomatic negotiations of any seriousness. They had some backdoor, here's a backdoor move, okay. So a lady invites Benjamin Franklin over to play chess. And she's the sister of one of the Howe brothers. And she starts talking about America. They considered that diplomatic overture. Well, you know, it's not. It's an afternoon of chess. Anyway, the threats to American rights included undermining the judicial system, broad search warrant power, unilateral actions affecting a particular commodity like sugar or tea, undermining state and local democratic institutions. Now, what were the rights of English citizens? And this is an abridged set. This is just kind of, I have very limited time, so I could only talk about a couple. The rule of law. No one is above the law, not even the king. And that comes from Magna Carta 1205. Due process. No free man can be imprisoned, exiled, or stripped of his rights except by lawful judgment of his peers or law of the land. And that's Magna Carta as well. Taxes have to be enacted by Parliament, not the monarch. And that's from the English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution. Okay, here's an important one. The monarchy may not maintain a standing army during peacetime without Parliament's approval. So undermining trial by jury, another element of the Sugar Act that undermined trial by jury. Britain was trying to get a hold of, get its hands on smuggling. Smuggling was rampant. It was like a national pastime in the colonies. Long coastline, hard to defend. Anyone accused of smuggling had to be tried before a judge and not a jury, and they had to get up to the Admiralty Court in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I talked about the Murder Act. Another one is judges would be appointed and paid by the crown rather than local democratic assemblies. So unaccountable judges. The Townshend Act included broad search warrant power, writs of assistance. Now it was only in effect for 3 years, but it allowed the crown to search homes and businesses without a specific target. They say, just go root around in Sam Adams's house, not go look for evidence of whatever. This quartering of homes, I mean, what an intrusion, right? There was also threat to the economic rights of colonists, the unilateral regulation of sugar, and it forced Americans to get their sugar from British-owned Jamaica and not other sources. The tax on paper, all these other taxes. The Tea Act, they wanted to stop the smuggling of Dutch tea. And finally, the closure of the Port of Boston. The Massachusetts Government Act canceled previous charter and created a new one, moved the capital, prohibited town meetings, and all taxes were passed by Parliament without consulting with democratically elected assemblies. So another big thing is the proclamation of 1763. King George prohibited American settlements past the mountains because, and reasonable, he didn't want to maintain forts and the cost troops are too high. But the population pressure was too great in America. And so thousands of Americans disregarded it and moved west. This is what a Choctaw chief might have worn, called "The Americans are a great deal more ambitious and numerous than the English. They put us out of our lands, forming therein great settlements, extending themselves like a plague of locusts." So many tribes were going to side with the British during the Revolution because they wanted to keep their lands. So these intolerable acts have passed, and they didn't pass all at once. It was like rolled out one after the other. So the colonists had barely gotten used to one when another one came rolling out. They met in Philadelphia. They agreed on a boycott of buying and selling British goods. They established committees of observation and inspection to enforce the boycott. A lot of abuses of that. They instructed the colonies and local communities to assemble, arm, and train militia units. Here's some of the leaders in the First Continental Congress. I mean, it's like a who's who. John and Samuel Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren, John Dickinson. Joseph Galloway was the Speaker of the Assembly in Pennsylvania. Ben Franklin, John Jay, our first Supreme Court judge. George Washington, Patrick Henry, and then in Connecticut, Roger Sherman, and he would be very important during the Constitutional Convention. While they're meeting in Philadelphia, Gage, he was ordered by Lord Dartmouth, who was the secretary for the colonies, said, "Go out there and seize weapons and gunpowder." And so he did. He seized a large store of gunpowder in Somerville. And then this thing still exists. It's made of stone, and they used it to store the gunpowder for the various towns. And the soldiers got away with just seizing the gunpowder. They moved by longboats by sea at 4:30 a.m. and it spread misinformation and panic through New England, a widespread fear that the soldiers had fired on and killed the colonists. Continental Congress heard about it, and they were afraid the war had already started. Church bells tolled, and fire beacons, they put beacons on the hills. So you'd light a beacon, and then someone next to they'd light a beacon. And so it's just a way of alarming people. Of course, church bells are a good way too. The militias marched toward Boston. 20,000 men from Boston marched for Boston from the Connecticut Valley. So that would be like Hartford and all the way down to the Atlantic. And they were halfway to Boston before they were called back. A crowd of 4,000 angry men attacked Tories in Cambridge. There was a street, and some of these houses are still there, beautiful big houses. And the Americans attacked it, and these owners were lucky to get away with their lives. I say this is a dress rehearsal for April 19th, 1775. Gage should have known, based on the reaction to the powder alarm, what would be coming if he did more of this. So he did abandon plans to go 35 miles west from Boston to Worcester. He was greatly outnumbered, and he knew it. And okay, get this. He asked London. He had proposed the Intolerable Act. He says, could you lift those up? And King George says, it's the most absurd that can be suggested. So he didn't say, sure, I'll lift them. No. Okay. So that's the lead up. So the war began in Massachusetts. And there are three battles that I'm talking about: Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the Siege of Boston. April 19th at 1 a.m., Gage sent 800 elite troops under a Colonel Smith, marching at a quick pace to Lexington. Thanks to Margaret Gage, the colonists knew the date of the operation and hid most of the munitions. By 2 a.m., the communities were alerted, church bells rang, and bonfires were lit. Paul Revere and William Dawes alerted the militia leaders in Massachusetts towns. So here's a map. This is what Boston looked like then. So all this water, it's now filled in now. So, but that's what it looked like. So he said, you know, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. This is what they were meaning. So it was 2 if by sea. So this is where the British soldiers came out and started marching. And then this is Paul Revere, and he went up to modern day Medford and then down and around. And William Dawes went underneath or south, and then they met up in Lexington. Revere was accosted by British soldiers along the road. They took his really good horse, but he grabbed another horse and he warned them, there are a lot of militia coming. And so they went, ugh, and they went going back. So they were at Lexington. Their main job was to alert John Hancock and Sam Adams, who were staying at the parsonage in Lexington. And they had to get them out of there and get them safe. And so they moved them first to Woburn and then to Worcester. So I'll be talking about that a little bit more. So Lexington was the first battle, and that's when you hear the term, the shot heard round the world. It's the British and the Americans shooting at each other on Lexington Green. And then the British soldiers, they definitely won that engagement. They killed a lot, you know, killed 8 Americans. I don't know that even one of theirs was killed. They marched along to Concord, and they looked for weapons and stuff. They set fire to barns. They set fire to houses. Waiting for them when they got to the Old North Bridge, hundreds of militia that had been coming from all parts of Massachusetts. So the militia had been alerted and they were converging. They were waiting for them in Concord. Then the British didn't do so well in Concord. They lost 9 soldiers. And so they started moving back to Lexington. And all the way back, they were attacked. The first big fight was, okay, I'm not quite ready to say that, but Miriam's Corner and Parker's Revenge. I'll describe that in a minute. So these militia, I always thought these militia were like a single person going on, I'm gonna go shoot. No, they were in small detachments. They were led by veterans of the French and Indian War. It was a lot more organized. And they were led by 2 commanders, Joseph Warren and William Heath, and that's an ancestor of Janet. I'm going to say that. Reinforcements came for the British soldiers and met them in Lexington, led by a gentleman named Lord Percy, and he helped have them have a more organized retreat back to Charlestown. He took the fresh troops and surrounded the exhausted troops and all the wounded and everything. And man, they would have lost a lot more men if it hadn't been for Lord Percy. 14,000 American militiamen came down on this battle, and 3,800 saw active combat. There were 95 American casualties and 269 British soldiers, including 19 officers. They lost a lot of officers in this. I'm going to show a short video that explains the battle.
That first shot would become known as the shot heard round the world. Suddenly, the British front file, formed by the 10th Regiment, opened fire.
Just let me get rid of this. It's been driving me crazy.
The second file then opened fire. One eyewitness described it as a continual roar of musketry. In a moment, 7 militiamen were killed, 9 were wounded, some severely, including Captain Parker's kinsman, Jonas Parker, who was not only shot down, but minutes later, bayoneted. The militia dissolved as the British troops, after reassembling to the beat of drums, moved forward with bayonets fixed to their muskets. Marching past the dead and wounded militiamen, the British troops headed to Concord, their ultimate destination. Arriving around 7 o'clock in the morning, as portrayed in Amos Doolittle's illustration of the event. All along the way, they heard church bells and drum rolls as militias across the countryside were responding to the emergency. When the British troops reached the North Bridge over the Concord River, they were met by an overwhelming force of militiamen blocking their way. Like at Lexington, neither of the commanders of the British force nor the militia wanted to start a fight. But they also would not stand down. British Captain Walter Loring, in command of companies from the 4th, 10th, and his own 43rd Regiments of Foot, realized he did not have enough men to force a crossing of the narrow bridge with such an enormous force of armed militia on the other side. Then, against Captain Lorry's orders, some of his own men opened fire, killing 2 militiamen and wounding several others, according to Colonel James Barrett of the Colonial Militia. The militia forces fired back to a chorus of fire, fire, fire. 9 British soldiers fell. Lorry's force was trapped. His ranks quickly fell apart, and the men ran back toward Concord. Then, beginning at a place called Miriam's Corner, a mile east of Concord, and nearly all the way back to Charlestown, militiamen swarmed along the side of the road, firing from behind trees and stone fences, inflicting heavy casualties within the British ranks. Although Lord Percy's Reserve Brigade finally appeared to offer some help, the heavy gunfire from the colonial militiamen was too much, as seen in this engraving of the event by Amos Doolittle. It was a bloodbath. As heavy rain began to fall, the British force was ferried across the Back Bay to Boston by vessels of the Royal Navy.
I wanted to mention a little bit about Amos Doolittle. He was a printer from Connecticut, and he came and interviewed people 9 days after the battle, so kind of fresh recollections. So that's the Battle of Lexington and Concord. 2 months later, Gage again wants to get control of Charlestown Heights, which is, Charlestown is a neighborhood of Boston now. And Lord Percy and William Howe disagreed with Gage's strategy. That not a good idea, because they would be below the Americans. They would be going up a hill, and you never want to be below going up when they've got guns shooting down at you. And Gage insisted on doing it. And so the British ships started bombarding Charlestown starting at 4 a.m. And they marched up Breed's Hill under heavy fire, and they took tremendous casualties. They did ultimately prevail. They brought artillery that came around the other way, but they lost 1,000 troops, killed or wounded, 40% of Gage's army. And on the American side, the casualties weren't as heavy, but they lost Joseph Warren. And Gage warned London that it would take a lot more troops to beat the Americans. Of course, King George ignored him. He was then recalled, and William Howe took his place in command of the British forces in America. Now, this is a little bit out of order time-wise. All these militia are just assembling from everywhere, right? And 3,800 of them actually fought in that Battle of Lexington and Concord, but they all converged around Boston, and they laid siege to Boston, trapping the British troops in there. And they cut off Boston from trade and food. And so it was tremendous hardship for Boston civilians and, of course, for British forces. It lasted 11 months. Other colonies tried to send food and clothing. It was awfully hard to break the siege. At this point now, George Washington is the commander of the militias. And what broke the siege were these 59 cannons they got from Fort Ticonderoga up in upstate New York. And he placed them in Dorchester Heights. And when the British saw them, they realized they were going to have to get out. The other thing that was happening is a lot of the British soldiers were sick, And they couldn't get good food. And so William Howe knew that he had to evacuate. And so he took his troops and some loyalists to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Well, if you were a brain surgeon, or maybe they didn't have them then, if you were a really smart person, you would see some things in these battles that you would go, okay, so what are the lessons? This is, by the way, Francis Smith. He's the commander of the British forces that marched out to Lexington and Concord. The British underestimated the fighting ability of militias. Some of that might have been a class consciousness because the British officers tended to be aristocrats. They bought their commissions, so they kind of looked down on these American riffraff, including my ancestors, right? And so they underestimated them to their peril. Britain needed a much bigger force and to overcome civilian opposition and militias, and they would never really provide a much bigger force. They sent a big force to invade New York City, but that was something that always plagued the British commanders, as there wasn't enough troops for them. The British commanders were in competition and conflict with one another. So Percy refusing to participate in this Battle of Bunker Hill is an example, and it would get worse and worse as the Revolution went on. Britain really struggled to provide food and horses and weapons to its soldiers. Something like 40 ships were sent from Britain to America during the siege of Boston, and with supplies, only 9 got through. They'd get intercepted by American privateers. They'd get blown off course. This didn't work. I heard a talk by a professor, I think he may have been a British professor, and he said, General Washington prevailed, but he was assisted by General Atlantic and General Demographics. So what are the lessons from 1775 for the Americans? Americans had effective spies, think Margaret Gage, and popular support. The militias could really hamper British progress. But Washington needed to put together an army on very limited resources. So he knew right away that it was going to be a real tough slog. The other thing is that French support was already present, even though we don't hear so much about that. But they gave money to equip 25,000 soldiers for America in 1775. And they were to be in the Battle of Saratoga, which was very decisive victory for America. 90% of the Continental Army used French weapons, and all of them, including the militia, used French gunpowder. So they armed Americans. 12,000 French soldiers would fight in the Revolution, and the French Navy was extremely important in the Battle of Yorktown, which effectively ended the Revolution. So I'm going to look at my time and see how we're doing. I'm about out of time. Can I keep going a few minutes? Okay. So how you experienced it depend on who you were and where you lived, okay? Some areas saw a lot of fighting and tremendous civilian suffering, mid-Atlantic and down in the South. Here's a map of the battles. So if it's surrounded in blue, it means the Patriots won. If it's surrounded in red, it means the British won. And so here's these early battles. Oh no, that's Saratoga, I'm sorry, ignore that. This is Bunker Hill, Lexington, and Concord. And then Britain invaded New York City in 1776. And we lost a bunch of battles, White Plains, Brooklyn Heights, and then we lost a bunch of battles in Philadelphia. We won Princeton and Trenton. That was when George Washington led the troops across the Delaware River. And then the war moved south. British said, well, we're not doing anything here. We're going to go south. And they would move their troops via boat because it was too hard to move them overland. And so they came down here. There was a big battle in North Carolina called Guilford Courthouse, and that was kind of a draw. But then 2 victories for the Americans, Cowpens and Kings Mountain, drove Cornwallis up. He was going to get evacuated out of Yorktown. But Washington came down from New York with Rochambeau, I believe. And the French Navy blocked off the British Navy, so Cornwallis had no escape. So that, in a very, very brief nutshell, is how the revolution happened. So different people, according to their status, really experienced it differently. For enslaved people, it was the opportunity for freedom if they joined the British cause. Poor men and boys, they fought in the Continental Army. Women, hard physical labor, and they were in great danger from British and Hessian troops. There was a lot of rape. The British troops did a lot of rape throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So it was dangerous, dangerous time. Farmers served in state and local militia, and those are my 7 ancestors that fought in the Revolution. They were farmers. They'd serve in the middle of the summer. Their average age was 21. Wealthy merchants, a lot of them fled to England or New York City to avoid the fighting. Native Americans were wooed by both sides, but most of them fought for the British. So Gordon S. Wood says the biggest emancipator until the Civil War was the British Army. Nearly 1 in 5 enslaved people sought liberty. Most were captured and returned to their owners, but 20,000 joined the British Army. And after the war, they would be freed and resettled in England, Canada, and the West Indies. And unfortunately, a lot of Black soldiers died of disease in the South. There were 9,000 Black Patriot troops, 5,000 of whom were engaged in combat. They had long terms of enlistment, and so pretty much 1 in 5 members of the Continental Army were Black. They're not necessarily portrayed that way in images of the Revolution, but that's reality. The Continental Army initially were people like my ancestors who maybe took a couple of months off and went and fought in the militia. But after 1777, it was indentured servants, recent immigrants, former slaves, and poor men. Very loyal to George Washington, and they endured terrible, terrible conditions. The militias uniformed themselves. Some had to arm themselves. They were decisive in the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They drove the British out of Boston, and they helped in Saratoga and Yorktown. How about women? Are they sitting at home milking the cows? They were doing that. But this is a famous lady. Her name is Margaret Cochrane Corbin, and she went with her husband. She was an artillery. She did work in the artillery. And her husband was killed at the Battle of Fort Washington, but she kept working even though she was wounded in the shoulder, chest, and jaw. She's called Captain Molly, and she received a pension from Congress. In 2021, New York Harbor Veterans Facility was named in her honor. This lady, and we may hear more about her from Michelle Ricky Pitt, who's I know here, who's going to talk about women spies and scouts in the Revolution. She was a scout, and she warned the militia of British forces approaching in the Battle of Cowpens, and she helped alert the militia. The Native Americans, obviously, they have a very vested interest to keep Americans away from their territory. They both tried to entice Native Americans. The big one was the Iroquois, and they were a warrior tribe. And it split the Iroquois Confederacy. 4 sided with the British and 2 with the Americans. And they never recovered from that. 2 big tribes, the Delaware and the Shawnee, wanted to be neutral, and they got sucked into the fighting. They couldn't stay neutral. The Catawba tribe were allied with Americans in South Carolina. The British soldiers, 40% were German. They weren't, we think of them as mercenaries, but they were more like a rented army. Think the North Koreans in Ukraine. That's more what they're like. And when they invaded from Canada, it really felt like an invasion to people in upstate New York. 15% of the German soldiers stayed in America. And as I said, the British soldiers were not disciplined for raping women. They enraged Americans. The British soldiers on this 40 ships, only 9 landed and they were empty and stuff like that. So the soldiers had to get food from around the countryside. And they just plundered all these farms. And it just really, really angered the American farmers. It really turned anybody who was neutral or loyalist against the British cause. Now, there were loyalists, people that stayed loyal to the crown. And in the beginning, they were in the 1760s and 70s. They were hounded, threatened, tortured till they resigned their posts. At the beginning, loyalists were maybe a fifth to a third of the American people from a cross-section of society. But by the end, about 15% were loyalists, treated very harshly, especially after Saratoga. Their lives were in jeopardy if they supported the crown, and their neighbors knew about it. So a lot of them switched sides just to avoid mistreatment. I love this. This is a guy named Mather Byles. Is that a great name? Look at that wig. Which is better, to be ruled by one tyrant 3,000 miles away or 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? Clearly, we know where he ended up on that. Okay, so I'm about to wrap up. So a lot of the excesses during the revolution were addressed in the Bill of Rights. Vigilantism, writs of assistance, quartering troops, The ideals remained: the human rights, consent to the governed, right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, separation of powers. You could argue about that one right now. Due process of law. Okay, since the revolution, Americans drink coffee. Because if you drank tea, people thought you might be a loyalist. Yeah. Americans don't bow. Remember the scandal when Obama bowed to the Japanese? And a big gap between our ideals and reality. So I'm going to close with this. This explains the gap between ideals and reality. That was, isn't that great? That was Nick Bargatze, and that was Saturday Night Live. But Janet, you can turn the lights on. I think I'm going to stop now. So I know it's a lot in a short period of time. I hope I wasn't talking real fast to get all the information in. But anyway, we have a class, Topics in the American Revolution, and every Friday at 10 in this very room. And so one of the people that helped plan the class, Kevin Phillips, was an actor in Lexington before he moved to California. And so it's going to be talking about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Okay, so a few questions. Yes?
I think we only have time for a couple.
Just two.
The battle was on Breed's Hill. Why did they call it Bunker Hill?
Oh, okay. There's 2 hills. Breed's Hill's the first one, and then behind it is Bunker Hill. Breed's Hill is where the Americans mowed down, and then Bunker Hill is where the Americans had to retreat. Anybody else?
Could you just talk about the use of rape as a war technique?
Who is that speaking?
It seems obscure, and yet every group does it.
Well, not every group. I mean, they didn't rape high status women. In one town, they raped every woman between the age of 7 and 70. Oh. They were not disciplined for doing it. It was regarded as, got to remember, these troops are a long way from home. They're not being fed very well. These people are shooting at them all the time. And I'm sure it was a power move just to get even with all these people, would be my guess. But I want to contrast the behavior of the British soldiers with the behavior of the French soldiers. The first French soldier to steal from an American, he stole some Parmesan cheese. I don't know how they got Parmesan. Anyway, they did. And he got punished pretty badly, physically, right? Beaten, flogged, and they had the whole group come and watch. So they're warning him, you do this, you're going to really suffer a consequence. So the Americans liked the French soldiers. Also, they had silver and gold on them. So Americans really needed that. So with that, keep your eyes peeled. Ken Burns, I think, starts soon, right? With his documentary.